Welcome back to another week of painting with Bloodline Brushworks. I'm Sherrick, and this week we're tackling something new, a cartoon style. Okay, I can already hear you guys in the comments down below going, Sherrick, what's a cartoon style? How are you going to do that? And the answer is we're going to bump up the saturation of colors and how vibrant they are. We're going to lower the amount of definition that we put in there, so it's not going to be with a feather, so to speak. I'm not going to put each little, notch in the feather or anything like that. It's going to be very general colors, very high contrast. So we want one part to look dark and the part that is going to be hitting the light to look light. We don't want much transition. We don't want very many middle tones or any really at any point on these pieces. So I will show you as we go through how I make some of these choices. Bear in mind, this is a very back and forth process as with any miniature you paint. So I made mistakes doing this. You might make mistakes doing this. Learn from some of my mistakes that I'll point out as we go. And then hopefully you can limit the amount of mistakes that you make, and this will be an easier process for you. But it is very simple. It doesn't take nearly as much time as it did to do like a regular model like the Red Witch or some of the other models that I've done. And it looks amazing. At the end, it really does look like a cartoon. It pops really well. So there is something to learn here from this, and we'll discuss that a little bit at the end of the video when we get there. With that being said, let's jump over there and get to painting. So right out of the gate, you're noticing that I've put my base color down and I'm adding these shadows. These shadows that I'm putting here are to emphasize the shadows that already exist. I don't want them to come too far out of where they would naturally be. And that way they just add extra definition in the shadow, but allow us to keep that high contrast that works so well for a cartoon look. And as previously stated, we're going to talk about some of the mistakes I made as I was painting this and had to restart some stuff. And one of those was trying to go for a cell shaded style, thinking that would achieve the cartoon look that I was looking for. And while it will, I found that it lends itself better to certain types of models. Not that it wouldn't work on Henlo here for Townsfolk Tussle, but as I was trying to produce it, I realized it became way too cluttered and too much very quickly. So I think on smaller models, less is more, unless you really have that cell shaded style dialed in or have a slightly larger model than this one here. It also creates creative clutter, and by that I mean there's a lot to contend with and look at, and it can be a little bit overwhelming when you're seeing it all. And once you get to this point where you're ready to like put in your panel lining and stuff like that, I found that I had kind of lost my way and was struggling to figure out where would I even put that lining, or would it actually look good once I get it in there. So something that I found very comforting and helpful while I was doing this was to try to take a much more simplistic approach than I'm used to with miniatures, and to work in what would basically be considered base coats and see if I actually needed transitions or layers from there. And with some colors I did. Some colors I layered up from a darker color to a higher color, which established more of a base color underneath what I was going to lay later. But with others, it just wasn't necessary. As I work in this way with base coats, it does seem very bland and doesn't look like it's gonna pop at first, but I promise if you trust the process and add more colors and keep on going, at a certain point it'll just look straight up like a cartoon and you'll be happy with the results. So here we run into one of the first mistakes that I made, and that is that I didn't undercoat this white. And I could have just done a zenithal, even though we're not looking to establish any details or shadows with that zenithal coat, but it would have made it easier to build up the white with a brush. And early on, I kind of started to see a little bit of a splotchy thing going on and some brush strokes building up, and I wanted to avoid losing some of that smoothness. So I switched over to my airbrush and puttied up the model and got white where I needed white to go, and then I come back and touch up some of the clothing and go ahead and finish off the white. I know failure can really feel like a downer and discourage us from finishing a project or even starting new projects on models that we want to look really good and we just don't feel like we have the skill for it yet. But I'm a firm believer that failure breeds success. And in that, I mean, if you fail, go ahead and find the fix, work through it and succeed in that project, or at least something you can be proud of, because that little bit of success that you find through that failure is compounded with other failures that turned into successes. And that's what allows us to master our craft and really approach future projects with a certain tact and poise that allows us to be smarter and more efficient about how we tackle that project. Now that I've fixed my mistake with the airbrush and got a smooth white on here, I switch over to a cool gray to start establishing the shadows. And what I did before I put the brush on the model was took a look at some references that I found on the internet and tried to find out where in a cartoon, if I was drawing it for animation or something like that, where I would put the shadows to establish that visual effect, and then looked at the model as well to kind of look where I wanted the light to come from and how that would establish its own shadows on the model naturally. And so I established where I knew for sure the shadows were going to be on this model from a cartoon aspect, and then I shied away from going too far to make sure that there was room for the light to do its own thing on the natural colors, because again, if you look at cartoons, they don't have a lot of midtones and crazy transitions and stuff unless you're talking about more modern cartoon and animes. So we want to keep it that simple style because this game very much has an art style that's from the 1920s and 1930s, and they weren't really doing that back then. The light will also create a unique shadowing on the model once it's done that will help reinforce that theme that we're going for and making it look like a cartoon. Now we're going to move over to the feather tufts that are all over his body and on his elbows, and you'll notice that I painted those with the same shadow color that I used in the shadows on his body. And the reason I did that was to avoid panel lining, because the black is just too bold and harsh in my opinion. This will make those look a little bit more a part of his body and really help them to sell as feathers in a cartoon style. So what we're going to do is we're going to build it back up to the same ivory color that I used on his body. I move over to the legs, and I started with this really light orange and quickly realized that I might want to have some darker colors to show depth for the toes in the shoe. So I switch over to the darker orange so I can get that depth I'm looking for and start working up to the lighter orange from there. It's important to keep in mind that this is a back and forth process, and when you're approaching something new like I am here, you're going to make mistakes. There's going to be moments where you put something down and it just doesn't feel right, and it's okay. We can go back and paint over that, or we can look up references before we go back to it to try to find a path to achieve what we're looking for, and that'll give us just another tool in our tool belt so that the next time we run into this type of idea, we can go ahead and pull that tool out and know exactly what we learned from the last time and apply it to the next model. When I finished up the base coat of that dark orange, I was moving over to the light orange. I was originally going to use the dark orange to create a panel line in between each rung around the leg to create a little bit of texture like chickens have on their legs. And I realized that it would look a little bit more like a cartoon if I alternated the dark orange and the light orange on each one of those rungs. I also wanted to come back later and put black lining in, so this back and forth pattern helped me to be able to use that black lining to break everything up and give it a more hand-drawn feeling. I moved over to working on the reds, which encompass the top of his head, right under his chin and his shoes. And I started with this dark red and then moved up to a regular, I guess what you would call a mid-tone, because I did put some highlights onto his shoes later on after I did the rims around his ankles. But I decided that I didn't want the soles of his shoes to be black, because that, again, was a little bit too stark and I felt like stuck out too much. So instead, I left the soles that dark red color and built everything else up to my regular red. And then after I did the rims around his ankles on the shoe, I came back and did some highlights on the shoe near the rips where his toes are breaking out, and also on the top of the shoe in a couple spots to kind of add highlight, because I felt like it was getting a little bit too dark down there and needed something to break it up. We're in the final stretch now, and we're going to work on the final details. So we'll start with the eyes, which in this case are going to be pretty easy to get done because they're so big, and they even sculpted a little groove in the center for that cartoonish looking pupil. So basically we're just going to paint them with a titanium white from Pro-Acryl to really make them bright and cartoony against the white feathers of his body. And then we're going to slap a little bit of black right into that groove and do a little touch up if we need to, but for the most part, I think if the consistency of your paint is correct, this part should be pretty easy. Right on theme with the rest of this cartoon style, when we start the beak, we're going to start with a dark yellow, and we're going to choose a brighter yellow that is distinguished from that darker color so that we can get some shadows in there. And most of the beak will be covered in the brighter yellow, except for the undersides, like in the mouth and right under by the chin. But we will also later on come back in and put a little bit of a pale yellow right on the top of the bill, the center line of the bill, and a little bit on the very front tip of the bill as well. And this just gives a little bit more extra definition to the bill and breaks up some of that color so that it looks better. I'd seen in a reference picture that I was using that they had made his cheeks rosy, so I went ahead and came back with the titanium white and popped his cheeks out a little bit more by just highlighting them with it, and then decided to do the same thing right above his eyes there so that his eyes were a little bit more drawn to on the entire piece. And this is one of the big reasons why I don't go all the way to white when I'm painting white things. It's best to work in ivories or grays and move up from there, because titanium white is the brightest I can go. And if I start there, well, I don't really have anywhere to go if I want to highlight or really make a spot pop out more. Years ago, I had seen a Gundam artist paint a model kit and use a Pigma Micron to panel line instead of using panel liner. And so I wanted to give that a try. I still have Pigma Microns from when I was working as an artist and drawing with pencil and pen. And so I had some laying around, grabbed the smallest one I had, and decided to throw some lines on here, and it worked out pretty great. The only caveat I would say you need to look out for is, depending on the tip size of your micron, if you try to do this, you might have to go back and do some cleanup. So I would go for a small but thick enough tip size to get a bold line in there and not have to go over the line to make the line weight heavier multiple times like I did. The size I used was a 0.03, so you might move up to like a 0.01 or even maybe bigger than that, depending on how thick you need the line to be. Moving on to the base now, I start by laying down this warm brown, a very red brown, so that later on I can have a setup for when I put my yellows down. I use desaturated yellows for the hay, and I do that because when I add some of the shade that I'm going to use over this to darken the recesses in between everything, it's going to add a little bit more of a warmer color to it and make it start to really pop out with a more saturated yellow hue. But you'll see that I'm using these very sweepy, sketchy lines as I build up texture, and some of those lines actually go against the flow of the hay that was sculpted into the model. And the reason I do that is to give a little bit more variance and realism to the hay. Again, this is a cartoon style, so I don't want to get too realistic with this, but I do want it to sell an effect of hay pretty well. So one of the things that we'll do later is we'll use some dry brushing to go ahead and blur some of that high definition detail out and make it look a little bit more sketchy, like a cartoon. Now all that's left to finish up this model is this rim area on the base, and we're going to paint that a green grassy color. And what we're going to do is go ahead and make it match the game board that you play on. I'm going to use a sponge as well as my detail brush to create some sketchy lines and build up some textures to really make some grass textures pop out. And we're going to work up from this bluish green, and we're going to work more towards warmer greens, more yellows into the green. And this will help those yellower greens as we work up to pop out a lot more and give some nice variance and depth to the grass as well. Some of the techniques to build up texture here, you're going to see me use as a sponge to make little patches of color, as well as pulling out my detail brush and making little sketchy lines to simulate grass blades popping up out of those blotchy spots and on the edges in some places. This is an area where you could make the call to use some 3D rendering to make the grass pop if you wanted to, such as Epic Base's grass tufts. Those would work really well. However, I didn't want to clutter up the base with more 3D pieces, so I opted out of that, but if you place them right, I think it would work just fine. You could also use grass tufts. However, we're going for a 1920s, 1930s cartoon style, so in that time period, they would look way too realistic, and cartoons during that time just didn't have that much detail cranked into them. I'm wrapping up the final details on the base now, so I'll leave you with this footage to enjoy and watch, and I will see you at the end of the video for the reveal. And here's the final reveal. I think all things considered turned out pretty good. I'm proud of what I was able to create here. We did run into some different obstacles along the way that we had to correct, but again, those are ways to level up your painting and to add new tools to your tool belt. Overall, this model does match the aesthetic of the game itself, so I'm very happy with that, and definitely look forward to painting the other members of Townsfolk Tussle here with you guys. So if you have that game, look forward to that, and until next time, remember to turn your gray into glory. See ya.